The morning of July 28, 2010, began normally over the sprawling metropolis of Karachi, Pakistan. At the airport, a sleek Airbus A321 belonging to Airblue was being meticulously prepared for its journey. This was Airblue Flight 202, destined for the capital city of Islamabad. By 2:41 UTC, the pre-flight checklists were fully underway. 146 passengers had boarded for the brief journey. At 2:52 UTC, the heavy twin engines roared to life, lifting the jet gracefully into the overcast and hazy morning skies. As the heavy aircraft steadily climbed, fatal dichotomy quietly emerged on the flight deck. In the back, attendants served warm tea to relaxed travelers. Up front, a toxic psychological environment was rapidly taking shape. The captain initiated what should have been a standard route check with his co-pilot. Routine quizzing keeps the crew sharp and highly aware of specific route details and standard operating procedures. But what transpired went far beyond any normal professional reinforcement training. According to the accident report, the captain engaged in a relentless verbal assault. Investigators explicitly categorized this long interaction as a humiliating session. The captain adopted an incredibly condescending tone, harshly reprimanding the first officer. Over 60 agonizing minutes, he methodically dismantled the first officer's confidence. By the end, the first officer was completely subdued, quiet, and tragically submissive. This deliberate destruction of crew resource management became the central pillar of the horrific and impending catastrophe. When Flight 202 was 155 miles from Islamabad, the crew tuned into the ADI's broadcast. It provided crucial updates regarding airport weather and runway configurations. The broadcast informed them that runway 12 was active for arriving aircraft. The crew briefly discussed the navigation waypoints to approach runway 12. Because of wind conditions and local infrastructure, the captain had to perform circling approach. A circling approach is an intricate, highly demanding, and manual flight maneuver. The captain was required to initially line up with runway 30 using the instrument system. Once close enough to visually identify the runway, they were supposed to turn right. Following this break, pilots must fly a precise, rectangular pattern at a low altitude. They fly parallel to the runway, maintaining strict visual contact at all times. Once abeam the threshold, final sweeping left turn aligns the aircraft for touchdown. It sounds straightforward, but it is a delicate dance of timing and strict geographical precision. The visual circling area for an A321 is confined to a protective boundary, a strict 4.3 nautical mile semicircle. If a pilot executes turns too late, the aircraft drifts outside the safe zone. The golden rule of any circling approach is continuously maintaining visual contact. If the crew loses sight of the runway environment, they must abort the landing immediately. There is absolutely no room for debate on this strict safety rule. However, on this fateful morning, the captain made a profoundly dangerous, unauthorized decision. Rather than flying the tight visual pattern manually, he decided to use the automated navigation mode. In nav mode, the Airbus blindly follows a pre-programmed line in its computer. The problem was that a computerized navigation approach for this circling maneuver did not exist. To force the automation, the captain instructed his beaten-down first officer to input unauthorized waypoints. The flight computer essentially generated final waypoint far out on the extended center line. Because the first officer was thoroughly intimidated, he never once raised an objection. As a direct result, the autopilot's planned flight path ballooned outward, becoming significantly wider. This customized route guaranteed that Flight 202 would be carried well outside the protected zone. It pushed the aircraft directly toward the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the Margalla Hills. At 3:57 am, the captain confidently briefed right-hand downwind pattern. As the Airbus continued its descent, the captain formally requested this from air traffic control. The controller promptly denied the request, citing strict airspace limitations and encroaching terrain. The captain verbally acknowledged this rejection, yet his internal mindset remained stubbornly fixed. Soon, the aircraft was established on the instrument landing system for runway 30. The controller cleared Flight 202 to descend and perform the standard circling approach. Refusing to let it go, the captain brazenly asked for the right-hand approach again. The controller firmly reiterated that a right-hand pattern was not permissible under current conditions. Despite the explicit denial, the captain continued pushing the aircraft lower into the thick clouds. he vocalized an intention to descend to an altitude of 2,000 feet. The first officer meekly reminded him that the minimum safe altitude was 2,500 feet. At 4:37 am, the captain commanded the A321 to break off the ILS approach. This right turn placed the airport safely off their left wing, but as the jet flew the outbound pattern, it continued dropping dangerously to 2,300 feet. Despite being dangerously low and blind, the crew instructed the autopilot to turn left. As they passed a beam of runway 12, air traffic control urgently radioed the flight deck. The controller warned the crew they were drifting close to a restricted no-fly zone. Flight 202 was already 5 miles north, completely outside the protective circling area boundaries. Suddenly, the sterile silence was shattered by the urgent voice of the warning system. Terrain ahead. They were flying directly away from the safety of the airport. They were heading straight into the towering peaks of the Margalla Hills. The first officer instantly recognized the extreme peril looming in their path. Desperately, he pleaded, "Sir, higher ground has reached. Sir, there is a terrain ahead." He was trying everything within his diminished capacity to alter their deadly course. The captain, finally realizing something was wrong, began exhibiting signs of severe anxiety. The first officer voiced his dread once more. "Sir, terrain ahead is coming." The captain quickly assured his co-pilot that the aircraft was turning left. But it wasn't. The aircraft remained locked on its deadly, inescapable trajectory. Another automated terrain ahead warning echoed violently through the tense flight deck. In a frantic attempt, the captain aggressively twisted the autopilot heading knob left. But the Airbus A321 stubbornly refused to bank to the left. A few agonizing moments later, the aircraft incredibly began to roll to the right. The terrified first officer continued to beg his captain to pull up and turn away. The captain desperately tried to recover his rapidly spiraling situational awareness. He yanked back on the control stick, attempting to steady the descending aircraft. For a fleeting second, the nose pitched up and it began to climb, but the captain's hand remained frantically locked onto the autopilot heading knob. He desperately spun it left while shouting, "Why won't this plane turn left?" Tragically, the plane then began to lose critical altitude once again. The first officer uttered his final, chilling words, "Sir, we are going down." Moments later, the heavy aircraft slammed violently into the misty, forested mountain slopes. All 152 souls on board perished instantly in the catastrophic impact. The mechanical and procedural factors that doomed Flight 202 were set in motion early. The captain's toxic humiliation session directly neutralized the first officer's ability to forcefully intervene. A healthy cockpit requires the NON flying pilot to aggressively monitor and correct the flying pilot. This essential safety net was completely dismantled by blinding arrogance and hostility. The captain's fundamental misunderstanding of the Airbus flight control systems ultimately sealed their fate. On modern Airbus aircraft, lateral navigation operates in nav mode and selected mode. In nav mode, the aircraft blindly follows the computerized waypoints in the system. By illegally using nav mode, the captain forced the aircraft toward unauthorized mountainous waypoints, when ATC suggested a bad weather circuit that would have saved their lives. The captain scoffed. He turned to his first officer and arrogantly declared, "Let him say whatever he wants." This singular statement perfectly encapsulated the captain's lethal nonchalance and disregard for ground assistance. When the critical moment arrived to turn left, the captain made his final technical error. Because the autopilot was still in nav mode, turning the heading knob did nothing. To activate the new heading, the pilot must physically pull the knob outward. In his rising panic, the captain twisted the dial but completely forgot to pull it. The aircraft ignored his twisting and continued flying straight toward the looming mountains. As frustration grew, the captain kept spinning the dial further left without pulling it. He dialed the target, heading all the way down to 86 degrees. When he finally pulled the knob, the computer immediately sought the fastest route to 86. Since their heading was 300, the shortest path was a sharp right turn. The aircraft violently banked right, severely disorienting the already panicked, terrified captain. When the mountains suddenly appeared, he failed to apply maximum emergency engine thrust. He accidentally rolled the aircraft into a deadly left bank directly into the rock face. In the end, the tragedy of Airblue Flight 202 was entirely, tragically preventable. It was a disaster born not of mechanical failure, but of blinding human hubris. The captain possessed an attitude that actively rejected collaboration and casually dismissed standard safety protocols. He brushed aside explicit warnings from a desperate first officer and an air traffic controller. 152 innocent people paid the ultimate price because one man simply refused to listen.